In the small town of Petrosaltas, an old building that had been inactive for decades was hastily transformed into a makeshift hospital during the pandemic. The building, once a sanatorium, now housed patients in critical condition, and the dark stories that had circulated around the place seemed forgotten in the face of urgent need. But São Vicente's old sanatorium was still keeping its secrets, and it wasn't long before staff and patients alike began to notice that something wasn't quite right. My name is Emma. I've been a nurse for over 10 years, and I was transferred to the makeshift hospital in Petrosaltas due to a lack of staff. From the very first day I felt a strange oppression, a cold that didn't feel natural. The walls of the old sanatorium were thick and damp, and the dim light in the corridors created disturbing and moving shadows. I tried to concentrate on my work, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The first few days were chaotic, with patients arriving all the time and staff struggling to provide the necessary care. I met Carlos, an experienced and calm doctor, who became my support during those difficult days. He also felt something strange about this place but avoided talking about it. "We're here to save lives, not chase ghosts," he said, trying to reassure me. Over time, these strange phenomena began to intensify. Medical equipment broke down without explanation. Whispers echoed through the empty corridors and shadows danced on the walls. One night, as I was making my rounds, I spotted a figure standing at the end of the corridor. As I approached, he disappeared, leaving nothing in the air but an intense cold. I mentioned it to Carlos and other colleagues, but everyone seemed reluctant to discuss it. I began to investigate the history of the sanatorium in my spare time. I discovered that the place had a dark reputation, known for the cruel treatments and inhumane experiments carried out by Dr. Arthur Neves, a doctor obsessed with curing madness. Many patients never left the sanatorium alive, and rumors that their spirits still roamed the corridors were common among the long-term residents. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I decided to stay a little longer at the hospital to review some files. I was alone in the archive room when I heard heavy footsteps in the corridor. I got up and opened the door, but I didn't see anyone. I went back into the room, but the feeling of being watched only increased. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out, leaving me in total darkness. I felt a presence beside me and an icy whisper in my ear. "You shouldn't be here." My heart clenched and I ran out of the room, stumbling through the corridors until I found Carlos. I told him what had happened and he, clearly concerned, suggested we leave the hospital together that evening. As we walked down the corridor, we saw something that sent a chill down our spines. The shadow of a man, tall and thin, moving slowly towards us. He disappeared before we could react. From that moment on, Carlos and I began to investigate further. We spoke to older patients and discovered that many of them were also having visions and hearing whispers. One lady, Donna Marissa, told us about the existence of a basement in the sanatorium where Dr. Arthur was carrying out his experiments. We decided to explore the premises, hoping to find some answers. Going down into the basement was a terrifying experience. The air was thick and difficult to breathe, and the sense of oppression was almost overwhelming. We found a series of small rooms with old and rusty equipment. In one of them was a restraint chair with nail marks on the sides. It was a disturbing sight, but the worst was yet to come. Exploring the basement, we found an old diary, apparently written by Dr. Arthur himself. The notes detailed his cruel methods and attempts to control his patients' minds. One passage in particular caught my attention. He believed that by capturing the essence of madness, he could transfer it to himself, in search of a kind of immortality. As I was reading the paper, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw the silhouette of a man, his face disfigured and his eyes full of hatred. He approached quickly and I felt a crushing pressure in my chest. Carlos pulled me out of the room and we ran towards the first floor, our hearts beating frantically. We decided it was time to act. We assembled a small team of nurses and doctors who had also witnessed strange phenomena. Together, we planned to perform a banishment ritual based on Dr. Arthur's diary entries. We knew it was risky, but we saw no other way out. We prepared the ritual in the main wing of the hospital, lighting candles and drawing protective symbols on the floor. As we recited the words of banishment, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavier and a chill wind blew through the corridors. The shadows around us began to stir and murmurs filled the air. Suddenly, The figure of Dr. Arthur appeared before us with a sinister smile on his face. "Do you think you can throw me out?" he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "I'm part of this place. You'll never be free of me." A feeling of panic came over me, but I continued the ritual. My voice trembled. Carlos and the others joined me, reciting the words with greater force. The surrounding shadows began to recede and Dr. Arthur howled in fury. We felt a crushing pressure, but we remained focused. With a final cry, Dr. Arthur disappeared and the feeling of oppression began to subside. The shadows dissipated and silence filled the hospital. We felt immediate relief, but we knew that this experience would mark us forever. I left the hospital at dawn, exhausted but relieved. I felt like we'd finally freed the souls trapped there. I returned home with the feeling that peace was within my grasp. However, as the days passed, I began to realize that true peace was still out of reach. The paranormal events ceased, but the nightmares persisted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the patients' faces and felt Dr. Arthur's presence. Coincided with reports of disappearances at the sanatorium. It was clear that he had done something terrible to them, perhaps as part of his final ritual. We decided to make one last effort to banish Dr. Arthur's spirit once and for all. We prepared the ritual at the cemetery, using symbols and words we'd found in diaries and occult books. As we recited these words, the wind began to blow hard and the temperature dropped drastically. Shadows moved around us and whispers increased. Suddenly, the figure of Dr. Arthur reappeared, angrier than ever. "You cannot defeat me," he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the cemetery. "I am eternal." I felt a crushing pressure in my chest, but I continued the ritual. My voice trembled. Carlos was at my side, reciting the words fervently. The shadows around us began to dissipate and Dr. Arthur's silhouette began to disintegrate. With a final cry of fury, he disappeared, leaving only a heavy silence. The feeling of oppression began to ease and I felt immediate relief. However, I knew this was not the end. The trauma and memories would remain, and true peace was still out of reach. We returned to the hospital exhausted, but determined to continue our fight against the darkness. We felt we had reached an important milestone, but we knew the battle was far from over. So my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. True tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true peace, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never disappears completely, always ready to strike again. That night, we returned to the hospital with the feeling of having won an important battle, but something in the air told me that the war was far from over. Carlos and I were exhausted, mentally and physically, but we couldn't ignore the feeling that something was still wrong. I spent the night in the infirmary trying to get some rest, but my dreams were filled with disturbing images. I saw Dr. Arthur in different scenarios, always with that sadistic smile and eyes full of malice. I woke up several times in a cold sweat, with the sound of whispers still ringing in my ears. Early in the morning, I was awakened by a loud noise coming from the corridor. It was an alarm, something that had never happened before. I got up quickly and ran to see what was going on. I found Carlos and Martha in the hallway, both panicking. "We have a problem," Carlos said breathlessly. Several patients were experiencing simultaneous seizures, and that's not all. Some of them disappeared. My heart missed a beat. We ran together to the patient room. We found several empty beds, the sheets turned inside out, as if the patients had disappeared into thin air. Those who were still there were screaming and shaking, their expressions pure terror. It was as if they were seeing something we couldn't see. Suddenly, all the hospital lights went out, plunging us into total darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it down the corridor. The shadows moved strangely, distorting and forming grotesque figures. We felt a presence, something evil and oppressive. "Carlos, we have to end this now," I said, trying to keep my voice firm. "Let's go to the basement. I believe this is where the key lies to putting an end to this situation once and for all." We hurried down the stairs, the air getting heavier and colder with every step. We reached the basement, where the ancient symbols and macabre hotel were still there, a reminder of Dr. Arthur's atrocities. As we prepared the objects for the ritual, I heard a whisper behind me. I turned and saw the figure of Dr. Arthur, clearer and more menacing than ever. His eyes shone with indescribable hatred and he advanced towards us, his spectral form moving with terrifying speed. "Do you think you can banish me?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "I am eternal. You will never be free of me." The feeling of oppression was overwhelming. I felt my strength ebbing, but I knew we couldn't give up. I began to recite the words of the ritual, my voice trembling but determined. Carlos followed suit, his voice joining mine. The shadows around us began to move frantically, and Dr. Arthur's silhouette became more unstable. It was as if he were being pulled by an invisible force. He screamed in fury, his spectral hands trying to grab us. Suddenly, the basement was filled with intense light. The shadows receded, and Dr. Arthur's figure began to disintegrate. His cries of fury turned to screams of agony. With a final effort, he disappeared, leaving only a distant echo. The lights dimmed and silence filled the basement. We felt a temporary peace, but we knew that the battle had left deep scars. Patients were still missing, and the trauma of that experience still haunted us. We returned to the hospital, exhausted and shaken. We found Martha waiting for us with a look of hope mixed with fear. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," I replied, trying to remain calm. "But we know that true peace is still out of reach. The darkness may recede, but it never disappears completely. It will always be there, ready to attack again." As I write these words, I feel that true tranquility is still a long way off. The battle for our mental peace is constant, and the darkness will always lurk, ready to strike again. I hope that one day at last we can find true peace, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may retreat, but it never disappears completely, always ready to strike again. But for now, we know we've done all we can. And even if the darkness persists, we're ready to face it, together. True peace is still out of reach. But we keep on fighting, hoping that one day we'll be able to find a little light in the midst of